Welcome to the Mind Cut series.
You're listening to The Deep Dive.
This is where we really dig into a collection of sources, pull out the key insights, and try to give you a solid understanding of what's actually going on.
Yeah, it's more than just facts and figures. It's about understanding the why behind things, how it all connects.
Exactly. And today we're jumping into fitness and personal development, two worlds that are, well, deeply connected.
We've got some great material. A look at CrossFit's recent, shall we say, challenges.
And some really fascinating data on global fitness trends, plus some deeper reflections.
Right. Things like being an only child, dealing with self-doubt, something we all face, I think.
For sure. And that balance between ambition and gratitude, success, failure, it's all in there.
So our mission today is not just the what, but really drilling down into the why these things matter and, crucially, the how. You know, actionable stuff you can actually use.
We're aiming for depth, not just skimming the surface. Okay, so let's kick things off with CrossFit. It wasn't that long ago. It felt like they were absolutely everywhere. Now there's this sense of, well, turbulence. What's the story?
It's a really interesting case study, actually. How a movement that seemed so dominant can hit significant bumps in the road.
The sources point to a few things, right? Leadership issues, Greg Glassman specifically.
Yeah, and also some pretty serious internal operational problems. It kind of shows that even with a huge brand and a really passionate community,
it's not always enough for smooth sailing.
Exactly. The peak seems to have been around, 2017, 2018?
Which makes you wonder, can that kind of explosive external growth sometimes hide, cracks underneath, whether it's a company or even our own personal goals?
That's a great question. And what's fascinating is how CrossFit's struggles might have unintentionally cleared the path a bit.
For others to step in, like High Rocks, F45, Barry's, Orange Theory. Even those boutique Pilates places seem to be booming.
Yeah, it feels like there's always an appetite for the next thing in fitness. And the appeal of these newer options could be varied. High Rocks, for example, is mentioned as maybe being lower impact.
Ah, okay. So maybe attracting people who want that intensity, but with less wear and tear.
Potentially. And there's the accessibility point too, right?
Right. Signing up for a High Rocks event probably feels, less daunting for many people than diving into competitive CrossFit.
Absolutely. That barrier to entry is key. And let's be honest, the injury rate associated with CrossFit, even before the recent issues, was probably a factor for some.
True. It's not like just, deciding to go for a run, which almost anyone can do.
Precisely. Minimal gear, minimal specific training needed for running. CrossFit's a different beast.
So looking beyond CrossFit, what about the bigger picture? What broader trends are we seeing in fitness and health globally?
Well, one thing that just jumps out of the data is racket sports. Huge surge.
Pickleball was massive in 2023, wasn't it?
Totally. And now, in 2024, it seems paddle or padel, depending on where you are, is having its moment.
Paddle. That's the one like squash meets tennis in an enclosed court.
Yeah, exactly. Glass walls you can play off. Looks really dynamic and very social, too.
It just shows how quickly these things can catch on, doesn't it?
It really does. But shifting gears to something even more fundamental, sleep.
Ah, yes, sleep. And the stats here are, well, a bit concerning.
They really are. The tiny percentage of users actually getting over 7 hours consistently. It's quite stark.
And it feels like sleep is finally getting the recognition it deserves, maybe even more than steps lately.
I think so. It's being seen as this absolute pillar of health. And the point about trackers often showing less actual sleep than we think we got.
Oh, definitely. I think many of us have experienced that. Wait, I was in bed for 8 hours but only slept 6.5 moment.
Right. It shows being in bed isn't the same as quality sleep, which involves duration, sure, but also consistency, efficiency, how quickly you fall asleep, stay asleep, and managing stress.
And consistency seems to be really, really key, like regular bedtimes and wake-up times.
Hugely important. Dr. Matthew Walker's work highlights this. It's crucial for your circadian rhythm, that internal body clock. And that impacts everything, performance, longevity, risk of disease.
So that weekend lie-in, that social jet lag, could actually be messing us up more than we realize.
The research suggests it can have real negative effects, yeah. Disrupting that rhythm isn't ideal.
And the data shows Friday or Saturday nights are often the worst for sleep in the U.S. Makes sense, I suppose.
It does. And globally, you see these interesting cultural patterns, like the later bedtimes in places like Riyadh and Doha.
Attributed to late-night meals, shisha culture.
Yeah, and maybe using stimulants like caffeine or nicotine more often, where alcohol consumption is lower. It shows how deeply culture impacts even basic biology.
There were other little outliers too, right? Like alcohol in Ireland, reported sex rates in Azos in the US, cold plunging in Scandinavia.
Exactly. And activity-wise, you see differences too. The UK seems to have higher participation in weightlifting compared to the US, where walking, running, cycling dominate.
It highlights the diversity. Oh, and the point about tracking different types of lifting, powerlifting, weightlifting, bodybuilding.
Right, clarifying those definitions and the plan to add better tracking for things like bodybuilding, which is more about aesthetics, muscle growth versus pure strength or explosive power, catering to those specific interests.
Okay, let's switch lanes a bit. Let's get into the personal development side. That discussion on being an only child was really intriguing.
Yeah, thinking about how that specific upbringing might shape certain traits. The source mentioned things like maybe being a bit self-centered.
But also having this strong belief that you can achieve things and being comfortable around adults early on.
Exactly. And how those traits could actually be, well, kind of beneficial for a young entrepreneur. That sense of knowing what you want and just going for it.
It ties into that idea of needing to look inward to figure out your desires, not just seeking approval externally.
For sure. Maybe being an only child naturally gives you more time for that kind of solitude and self-reflection.
Perhaps. But then there's the flip side, needing to actually connect with the world and overcome potential isolation to make things happen.
Right. And the idea about potentially higher self-esteem from more focused parental attention.
And how that might build resilience against rejection later on. That's a powerful thought about early foundations.
And I like the point about sometimes having more conviction in the idea itself than in your own ability, especially early on.
Like the mission pulls you through the self-doubt.
Something like that, yeah. Believing it needs to exist can be incredibly motivating.
Which brings us squarely to self-doubt. A universal struggle, I'd imagine.
Absolutely. And the perspective shared was interesting that maybe it never fully disappears. And maybe a little bit is actually healthy, keeps you from being totally
unhinged.
Yeah, something like that. But obviously, you still need that core confidence, that self-belief to even try difficult things.
The story about the live show in London was a great example, achieving something significant despite that chronic doubt, purely through belief in the idea and just grinding it out.
And the strategy of trying to detach your personal identity somewhat from the immediate success or failure of your work. That's key for perspective, for well-being.
It connects to that idea of the founder needing to grow personally, right? So the company doesn't get stuck because the leader is stuck in that chaotic founder mode.
Definitely. Though that early stubbornness, that resistance to feedback, maybe it's necessary sometimes to get initial momentum, even if it's difficult.
Interesting tension there. Which leads nicely into balancing ambition with gratitude, that feeling of always moving the goalposts.
Oh, yes. The source really nailed that feeling for growth-minded people. You achieve something, and almost immediately you're focused on the next thing, barely pausing to feel, grateful or accomplished.
The anecdote about linking hard work, even suffering, with feeling worthy, that's a tough pattern to break, but it sounds exhausting and unsustainable.
Totally. Finding that balance between drive and genuine gratitude seems essential for not just success, but like actual happiness.
Right.
Avoiding being a miserable success.
And the distinction between gratitude and complacency is important too. They're not the same thing.
Not at all. Different brain chemistry even. Dopamine driving you forward, serotonin underpinning that feeling of contentment, of gratitude, and the idea of framing your work as being of service.
That shifts the focus, doesn't it, from just accumulation to impact?
It really does. Seeing the positive effect on actual users, that generates a different kind of meaning, a different kind of gratitude than just hitting numbers.
That feels more sustainable. And then applying that even to difficult life experiences, like grief, reframing it as an opportunity for growth. That's profound.
Incredibly difficult, obviously. But the personal story shared about navigating grief and finding unexpected positive growth through processing that pain.
Yeah.
It shows it's possible, even if unimaginable at the time.
And touching on that, running a company while grieving, that must be immensely challenging.
Absolutely. The source mentioned that initial, almost necessary emotional numbing, just to function.
A coping mechanism.
Right. But emphasizing that, eventually, you do need to process it. And having a supportive team around you is just critical.
The experience of delivering the eulogy being therapeutic. That makes sense. A form of release.
Yeah. And acknowledging that grief isn't linear, it comes in waves, triggered by different things.
The key seems to be allowing yourself the time and space you need for that process, whatever it looks like, not fighting it.
Exactly. Giving yourself permission to feel it.
Okay, let's circle back to something we touched on earlier, figuring out what you really want. You said that's often the first and maybe biggest hurdle.
I think so. The source suggested many people aren't stuck on the doing, they're stuck on the knowing. What do I genuinely desire?
And the answer isn't usually found by asking other people or looking outside.
Yeah.
It requires that internal work.
That self-awareness piece, which can be tough, especially when you're younger.
So how do you cultivate that? The advice was about paying attention.
Yeah, to what genuinely interests you, those little sparks, and those fleeting thoughts that pop up when you're quiet.
Which is harder to do if we're constantly glued to our phones, right? Drowning out that inner voice.
That's a huge point. The constant stimulation makes it hard to notice those subtle signals. The therapeutic advice was literally, pay attention to those fleeting thoughts, especially the ones that keep recurring.
They're clues.
Big clues. So creating space for that, maybe through mindfulness, meditation, just sitting quietly is really valuable.
Okay, so let's say you do figure out what you want. Then comes the pursuit. What are the pitfalls there?
Well, first, actually stating it clearly, putting it out there. Then comes the less glamorous stuff.
Hard work. Consistency.
Exactly. The source stressed these as real differentiators. The things that often look like luck from the outside are usually built on that foundation.
And then there's rejection. Getting comfortable with hearing no.
Absolutely essential for anything ambitious. And it's interesting how the fear of it can make us pull back, become insular.
When actually pursuing goals often requires being more outward-facing, more engaged, willing to ask.
Right. It ties into that idea of cynicism being sort of private way to guarantee failure, to avoid the risk of public rejection.
Wow, that's a sharp insight. So commitment is key.
Non-negotiable. And the personal story is shared about starting the company facing rejection because of being young, inexperienced, the idea seeming too crazy.
It shows how, even with commitment to the vision, your self-belief can still wobble under that pressure.
For sure. And that challenge of seeking validation from established people who just don't see what you see. The nightlife analogy was perfect.
And that reverse ageism, people doubting you just because you're young, that definitely exists.
Really does.
Okay, let's tackle failure. It feels like it gets romanticized a lot these days. Fail fast, fail often.
Yeah. The source offered a bit of a counter-narrative there. A personal dislike of failure, reflecting that maybe not having many big failures means you weren't pushing hard enough.
That's provocative. So the intention behind failure porn, as it's sometimes called, might be noble-like, reassuring people, get them to take action.
Possibly. But the argument made was that maybe we actually learn more from success, especially understanding the secret sauce behind truly remarkable achievements.
Because failures often happen for similar common reasons, while big successes often have unique ingredients.
That was the idea. And also, learning from failure is limited if you don't know what success actually looks like, what you're aiming for.
Right, like avoiding potholes is useful, but you still need a map.
Exactly. Sometimes avoiding the big mistakes is more valuable than just trying to go faster. It relates to that Matthew principle. Success breeding success. Leaders pulling further ahead.
The relationship analogy was good too. Lots of failed relationships tell you what you don't want.
But they don't necessarily show you what a great relationship does look like. You need that positive vision.
So knowing the red flags should help you find the green flags faster, not just become an expert in red flags.
Precisely. And maybe the learning from failure is often more about building resilience, dealing with the emotional hit, than gaining specific strategic insight.
But taking meaning from both successes and failures is ultimately the path to growth.
That seemed to be the conclusion. The anecdote about the near failure was telling how the lessons they thought they learned then would have been totally wrong based on what actually led to success later.
It shows how fine the line can be and how easily we can misinterpret things after the fact. Timing, luck, they play a role too.
For sure, post hoc rationalization is tricky, but the practice of reflection, that growth mindset, that's always valuable even if the specific lesson is debatable.
Okay, shifting focus again, insights from elite athletes. What stands out there?
That intense inner drive seems almost universal at the very top. Cristiano Ronaldo was the prime example given. You can almost feel the intensity.
But it comes at a cost, right? The unseen sacrifices.
Absolutely. The grueling training, the impact on other life areas. It's inspiring, but it also makes you pause and think, do I actually want that level of single-minded dedication and the sacrifices it requires?
Like with Michael Jordan or Elon Musk, maybe. Incredible drive, but potentially linked to other struggles. We often only see one side of the story.
Exactly. Focusing only on the success part misses the potential costs elsewhere.
Interestingly, though, it sounds like more athletes are becoming quite introspective. Stoicism, meditation.
Yeah, that seems to be a trend, though it contrasts with athletes who operate more on pure instinct, less analysis.
That idea of cultivated stupidity was fascinating, like deliberately simplifying, focusing purely on execution without overthinking. Matt Frazier was the example.
Right. Sometimes you just need to do the work without getting lost in your head. But alongside that work ethic, there's also a growing focus on the rest ethic.
Recovery is huge now. Measuring it, optimizing it.
Definitely. And top athletes are often early adopters, willing to experiment. Like LeBron or Michael Phelps using tracking tech way back, always looking for that edge.
Which brings us to the potential downside of all this data, health, anxiety, over-optimization. How do we manage that?
The philosophy presented is technology is a tool, not the boss. The idea that less knowledge is better is generally rejected information is powerful when used right.
And the design choices, like no screen, passive data collection, try to make it less intrusive.
Exactly. But acknowledging that, yeah, some people do struggle with obsessing over the numbers.
So what can help? The idea of focusing on weekly trends instead of daily scores, maybe delaying data access.
Those were suggestions. And the existing feature to actually hide recovery and sleep scores originally for Olympians is available to everyone.
Or the low-tech solution, just don't open the app for a few days.
Sometimes the simplest answer is best. And the device holds data for a long time, has a long battery life, so you can step away without losing anything.
The personal anecdotes were interesting too. That sleep study, REM-induced apnea.
Yeah, quite specific. And the brain sending signals for restless leg syndrome, but the leg's not actually moving, which led down a rabbit hole of looking at dentistry, airway.
And that potential breathing device based on musicians. Cool idea.
It really is. Shows how solutions can come from unexpected places.
And contrasting the sometimes chaotic reality of mornings with that ideal routine.
It just highlights the value of having those consistent anchors, things rooted in comfort and familiarity, especially before something important. Gives you a sense of control.
Yeah, that stability. So wrapping things up, circling back to desires, the danger of wanting too many things at once.
Right. That leads to feeling constantly spread thin, dissatisfied. The power lies in focusing intensely on a few key things.
And that James Clear quote is gold. You desire the life, but not the lifestyle. You guarantee disappointment.
So true. Wanting to be in a band sounds cool, but are you ready for the van tours, the dive bars, the constant practice? That's the lifestyle.
The Miley Cyrus Super Bowl prep example really drove that home, the unseen grind behind the desired outcome.
Exactly.
And finally, that idea of doing something just for fun, without needing to be the best or constantly improve, like the watercolors example.
Yeah, that coaching exercise, it's a challenge for many of us who tend to turn everything into an achievement goal.
Even hobbies become optimization projects.
Right. But maybe just enjoying the process, practicing for its own sake, can lead to improvement anyway, just more organically.
My pickleball game could probably use that approach, although...
Well, there's also satisfaction in gradual improvement, especially as we get older, maybe. Like yoga, it's personal progress, not really competitive.
True. Finding that balance.
So it comes back to being intentional about your desires and understanding and embracing the lifestyle required to achieve them. Focus is key.
Absolutely.
So we've covered a lot today.
We really have, from the shifts in the fitness world with CrossFit and new trends to the absolute bedrock of sleep.
To the nuances of personal growth, figuring out what you want, building resilience, balancing that drive with gratitude.
And rethinking our relationship with success and failure, learning from athletes, managing technology.
Our goal, as always, was to go beyond just the what's and explore the why it matters and how you might apply these ideas.
Hopefully we've sparked some thought. And on that note, here's something to leave you with. Take a moment this week, maybe. Reflect on your own goals, fitness, personal, career, whatever. Are they truly driven from within, or are they more about external pressures?
And crucially, are you genuinely embracing the lifestyle needed for the life you say you want?
What's one small, intentional shift you could make to align your actions a bit more closely with your deepest values and long-term well-being?
Something to chew on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Until our next exploration.